Good morning, New Day Fellowship. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. One of the translations, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Today we're going to talk about sheep and goats. And I'm going to get back to this passage, but I just wanted to lead with it because there's a lot of imagery that we're going to talk about later. But let's start out with just sheep and goats. For the early people of Israel, the Jews, the sheep and goats were both acceptable as food. The gestation length of goats before they, from time to conception to delivery of the baby is 147 days. Average, there's a kind of a range in there. For sheep, it's about 150 days. So they're pretty dang close. Sheep produce wool. Wool is a fiber that it has a lot of good properties. It is a fabric that sheds water. And so, like if you're wearing it against your skin and you perspire, it kind of works its way through the air and it keeps the moisture off of you. In fact, there's that whole passage about Gilead with the wool, leaving the wool out, and whether the wool was wet or dry in the morning. And I'm going to talk a little, not really more about that, but you're going to hear me say something a little later, and I hope we can put that back in perspective when we get there. But anyway, but it's a fiber that can be spun and made into clothes. It can be made into felt, which can be used as well, but it's not. Felt is usually not necessarily used as clothing as much as wool is, because a fiber that is spun is a little stronger keeping together than felt. Felt is wool that is kind of beaten together and added with some other stuff that I'm not going to really talk about. You can look up the process of how they made felt, but maybe a little disagreeable to some people, so I'll leave that out. But wool and felt. Goats produce mohair. Mohair is also a fiber that can be used that way. As clothing and that sort of stuff. One big difference is milk. You really don't hear people saying that they're going to have milk sheep. They don't really milk sheep, but you milk goats. And goat's milk is very sweet. It's pretty incredible what goat's milk tastes like. And you can take the goat's milk and also make it into cheese of different types. But like I said, people usually don't do that with sheep milk. So there's one big difference. But other than that, you can take both. You can shear them. You can use the hair. You can use it for that. Oldest mention that we have of somebody keeping sheep. I'm going to kind of go into sheep first. We'll deal with goats a little bit later. But it says that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain was a tiller of the soil. Now, when we get to the point about God not accepting the sacrifice, it really has nothing to do, I want to make this very clear, it has nothing to do with trying to say that a rancher's better than a farmer, that the guy who's keeping the sheep was better than the guy tilling the soil. That's not what the issue was. It was a heart issue. God did not look on the sacrifice because of what was in Cain's heart, not what was what they did for a living or what they offered for a sacrifice. I want to try to make that pretty clear. One mention early in the Bible is that when Abraham, who is then Abram at the time, not yet Abraham, but Abram, when he met Pharaoh, he lies to Pharaoh and said that his wife was his sister. And Pharaoh obviously liked Abram's wife, and so he had kind of showered Abram with sheep, oxen, camels, and donkeys. So that's a different part of the story, but sheep were involved in some of that transaction. Later on in the story of Abram and some of his wanderings, we run into a guy named Abimelech. Uh, uh, um, Abi means brother of, Melech means king. So this guy was the brother of the king, and Abimelech gave sheep and oxen. Sheep and oxen to Abram, but also later Abram gave sheep and goats to Abimelech. So they were transactional. They used them that way, and they did stuff. Okay, our first big real sheep story, though, starts with Jacob. Jacob has been sent to find a wife, and so he goes to trying to find the people that he's supposed to be looking for. He knows who he's supposed to be looking for. He's looking for a distant relative to find this wife. And he is at a well, and at this well, apparently every day they would gather all the sheep together, roll the stone away, and then the sheep would drink, and then they'd roll the stone back to protect the well and go on. Well, Rachel shows up, and Jacob moves the stone for Rachel to water the sheep, and then falls in love with her, tries to marry her, but then Laban, Laban becomes Jacob's father-in-law, but Jacob instead gives him Leah and not Rachel, and so he spends all these years of indentured servitude to Laban, keeping his flocks for the bride that he wants, and there's a whole lot of family dynamics, and it's one of those things that, yes, there's a dysfunctional family story there if you want to read it, and I think you should, but the way that they meet is actually over the process of who's keeping sheep and how that's going on. Now, at one point, though, Jacob is ready to leave and wants to leave, and he comes to Laban and said, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know very well the service I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If you allow me to say so, I have learned by divination," whatever really that means, but it was not prayer, it was something he shouldn't have been doing, "that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it." Yeah, it's a big statement. You pick it and I'll pay it, but don't leave. Well, then Jacob says, "You know that how well I've served you and how your livestock have fared with me, for you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again feed your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages." And so it sounds like he's made a good deal, but then Laban is kind of crafty and what's a good word? He's sneaky. He's not a straight shooter, and so he takes all the speckled ones and he sends them with his sons, and he takes that flock away. So there's nothing really in there for Jacob. So Jacob's still keeping the flock, but there's nothing in the flock that is spotted or that is speckled or the black lambs or anything like that. So Laban has, basically done that. But even the agreement that Jacob has with Laban, he said, "If you find one of those in my flock that is speckled or spotted or whatever, if you find that I've got one that's pure in my group, then you can consider that I've stolen it." And so that's a big deal. He's saying, we're going to make this deal between the sheep, but I'm not stealing your stuff, but this is the way I want this to work if you'll do this. Now, as I said, Laban's already sneaky. He's taken the ones that Jacob was supposed to have, and he's taken them away. So now Jacob, Laban's flock is supposed to be this pure flock that's all solid colored, right? Well, then it said, "Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods, and he set the rods that he had placed in front of the flocks in the troughs where they water, and this whole deal." And so then in the breeding process with this going on, even out of Laban's flock, they started getting speckled and spotted and whatever. And so we're going to get into that, but I want to go back to and use this, this is my statement for the day of something I've come up with. I think it's a human thing to try to explain a God thing. And when I say that, the human thing is we try to take the passages of the Bible, like when they laid the wool out and in the morning it was wet, and then said, well, if it's dry, then I'll listen to you. And so the next day the wool is dry. We tried to figure out how that works, what was the environment, whatever, when it was a God thing. So why are we trying to explain it when it's a God thing? But we do that, and I think that's fine. If you've heard of people try to explain what manna from heaven is, what was it? Was it a mold? Was it fungusum? Whatever. We try to do that. I think it's a human thing to try to explain a God thing. And so this is one of those things, too, that if you look through, you can find that people involved in science have tried to explain what Jacob was doing and how this worked. And why did he take a flock that looked pure in color, solid, and yet end up getting these speckled and spots? So, for the tree people, they said, I looked through and saw some of this. They said the poplar tree, and all other thing about this, they've all kind of said is that if you took these branches and you stripped them of the bark and then you soaked them with the water, that chemicals would come out in the water. And so you're actually kind of treating the water, and it may cause some things that may have actually changed the what they were getting out of the stock. Poplar said increase the reproductive rate. They got larger kids and lambs. Now, why does it matter how big the lambs or the kids, if you're talking about goats, how big they are? Well, the bigger they are, the less time it takes for them to get of a size that they can actually get away from predators. So little ones are easy for predators to get. Bigger ones are harder. The other thing that's a principle that kind of goes with this is how much milk the mother produces, because a mother that produces a lot of milk and the baby gets a lot of milk, the baby will grow faster, sheep and goats, than they will if they don't. So there's some issues there that even discussing, why these larger kids and lambs are important, but also why you can produce more offspring. And we'll talk about the numbers of that later. But anyway, poplar increased reproductive rate, they think, and gave them larger kids or lambs. Almond decreased kidney stones and urinary tract problems. The plane tree they were talking about, the Oriental plane, it's an anti-inflammatory. So if you have an older animal that's getting that, it's like taking a little aspirin. They feel a little better, more likely maybe to breed. Now, I'm going to talk into the science people that have looked at this, that are into sheep science and colorings and stuff, to say, how did this work? Well, to give you an example, in merino sheep, there are 2,200 genes regulating the color black and white. I know a lot about this as well as llamas, but horses and everything. We try to think that if you take, a white sheep and breed it with a white sheep, you're going to get another white sheep. You take a white llama, breed it with a white llama, you're going to get another llama. You take a black llama, breed it with, you try to do all these things. The reality is that the genetics of at least llamas, horses, and I guess sheep as well, of the colorations that I know of, is that it has so many different genes that it is very difficult to get any of the colors that you want. And there are dominant genes and recessive genes. And so in llamas, a black is a recessive deal. So if you really wanted white, you really wouldn't be bad off buying a black llama if you had a white female, because the recessive genes are going to be taken over by the dominant genes, because white is all dominant, recessive is all the black color in that. So even just the numbers there, it's incredible. The 2,200 genes for just this one breed of sheep for coloration. So it's not simple. The second thing is that you've got chromosomes they're linked, sex-linked X and Y chromosomes. So if you have when the male and the female breed, if it's a female, and then the father has provided the X, and that X is going to carry 50% of the coloration, so it's going to be very important in just changing their colors. We have genes that are recessive dominant. I talked about that. There's another interesting concept called gene switching. Sometimes genes can switch their how they manifest in animals. And there was one thing that I found that was just incredibly interesting, that in rabbits there's actually something called a chinchilla gene, and based on temperature when they breed, they can get different colorations. So even just the temperature of the environment. So it's highly complex with the coloration. But I said, Jacob has said, these are the ones I get to keep, and you get to keep those. Well, Jacob's no fool, and yeah, he's spent, 14 years or something already with Laban watching these animals, so he probably knows a little bit. No, he's not a geneticist, but he knows a little bit. But the other thing that happened that we have to take into account, I think, too, is that at one point, because this is working for Jacob, now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, he has gained all his wealth from what belongs to our father. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him as favorably as he did before. Wait a minute, he keeps getting more of these speckled and whatever, and I'm losing numbers. He's not happy about that. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your ancestors and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me as favorably. You have now served your father well, and have done all these things, yet he's cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. So probably on an annual basis, Laban has renegotiated the contract. I didn't really see this, but I think there may have been this in here, and that's why some of these people are reading this. But they think that maybe even on an annual basis, Laban changed and said, okay, I don't like this agreement we made last year about the speckled and spotted. This year, you get the solid ones. Okay? And on that year, the solid ones increased. Okay, this year you get the speckled ones. The speckled ones increased, the stripes, and over here. The striped ones, you get those next year. And the striped ones went up. So in other words, I told you, gestation is about 5 months. You can, depending on the breed of sheep and that sort of stuff, or goats, you can get at least one crop of offspring per year, but sometimes two, depending on what's going on. But on an annual basis, they're renegotiating this. Things are changing, and Laban can't keep up. Bottom line, I would say it's a God thing. But at the same time, we're going to try to explain this. It's a human thing to try to explain a God thing. But Laban doesn't have a clue of what's really going here. He's getting, he picks something and then he loses. It's like roulette. He picks a number on the wheel and he loses every time. And Jacob wins. What's going on here? Well, the other thing that I think is important to this story, if you're going to stay with the genetics, is during the mating of the flock, I once had a dream in which I looked up and I saw the male goats that leaped upon the flock were striped, speckled, and mottled. So Jacob has seen that. So God basically said to Jacob, if you're going to, what you need to put your token on to wager is you need to put it on speckled, whatever, black, whatever. Well, the other thing that we know about genetics is that by having, even if Jacob just did that one breeding cycle, and had the speckled or spotted or whatever colored into that flock of all the whites and everything else that are in there, or the solid blacks or whatever they were, whatever that color was, he has introduced some genes that then create problems down the road or change that down the road. And so, God's working the temperatures, God's working the whatever. And so every year, Laban just loses. And so he's not happy about it. And so finally they realize, hey, we just got to get out of here. Jacob picks it up, takes off. Well, in the process, Rachel, who was the one that Jacob went for and everything else, Rachel steals Laban's idols. And so Laban catches up with the brothers, and he's mad because you've taken all these. And he really can't argue about, you've got this flock, this is yours, that's the agreement. But let's also look at this in maybe a human way, is that he's trying any way he can to get Jacob back. Of course, he kind of believes that Jacob probably stole his idols, because if you're an idol worshiper, then that's what makes you have this fortune as your idol. So he thinks Jacob's taking his stuff. And so he's angry about that. Well, Jacob does not know anything about what Rachel did. And Jacob has basically said, if you can find your idols among my stuff, the person that has that can be put to death. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. And Laban's thinking, we'll find it in Jacob's stuff, we'll be able to kill Jacob. Well, little does he know, Rachel has it, and Rachel's actually sitting on it on the camel, and then she said, it's my time of the month, and so Laban can't look through the stuff. They never find it, and they get to move on. But it was interesting that didn't happen, because you can imagine that if he did find the idols there, then he would have put Rachel to the death because Jacob didn't do it. He might have tried to say, no, Rachel's carrying it for you, Jacob. We're going to put you to death. I don't know how that would have turned out. You can never know. But they this chasing him, it took them about a week to catch him. So there's this whole story and everything else. And even in the process, Jacob says to Laban, look, I've served you for 20 years. You change the deal every year. I've got these whatever. Well, I think the other thing that you got to look at is that at the end of the story, early in the morning, Laban rose up and he kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he departed and returned home. But they also created a monument there, a pillar that said, if you won't cross this and I won't cross, this is the border between us. We will not cross here. And so, which is sad, because now they got family dynamics that are really screwed up. But I think the other thing about this, the moral of that is don't be trying to cheat your son-in-law if you want to see your grandchildren. Because that's exactly what Laban did, and they were forever gone. And so maybe part of Laban's deal was he really wanted to keep his family together. He wanted to keep his daughters around. He wanted to keep his grandchildren. If he had worked a better deal out with Jacob, it might have worked. Maybe. Obviously Jacob was a good son-in-law. He worked hard. He prospered. But instead of saying, okay, well, you could share in this. Please take care of me. Make sure I get fed. But I'm happy with you being here and sharing in my wealth and keeping my animals, and they can be yours, and you'll get them someday. He didn't do any of that. And so, Laban tries to support his own natural sons and doesn't do anything with son-in-law, and he gets into trouble. Just saying. So, if you want to see your grandchildren, don't mess up your son-in-law. Now, the other thing that I kind of think there's a deal in here, a message maybe more to Laban, don't mess with God. He can make the head count come out any way he wants. So, moving forward in the Bible about sheep and goats, that at one point in the story, we've moved forward, Judah was in mourning and he went to his sheep shearers. Now, it doesn't really say, I guess he's just checking on what's going on. Because we've talked about Laban was off shearing sheep when Jacob did this, so they've got to shear the sheep. Well, this is the thing that when he runs into Tamar, his daughter-in-law, and he has this sordid affair, and they have a child, and, that all involved sheep in the first place. Moses, when he had the burning bush, correct that, sorry, not Moses. Abraham and Isaac, when he goes up on the hill to sacrifice Isaac because he believes that's what God's told him to do, when they speak to him and said, no, don't do that, he looks and he sees a ram in the bush. And so God has provided a ram whose horns have been caught up in this bush, and that's what they sacrifice. So the sheep's involved in that story. When they talk about in Exodus, and we're talking about Passover and that thing, there was a whole process of what they did. And so they would take a lamb without blemish, which means that they had to look over it. It had to be a solid lamb. It doesn't say did they have to be white or black or whatever, but it couldn't have a blemish. So once they had the lamb, the lamb would live with them for 14 days in their home. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later too. But they would bring this lamb into their home, and if let's say Micah and I are neighbors, but we're not wealthy, but between us we could afford one lamb, that was okay. Neighbors could share the lamb, and then they would bleed the lamb and put the blood over the doorposts, and they would cook the lamb and they would share it as a meal. But it was a sacrifice to God. But like I said, that lamb lived with them. Their children played with that lamb every day, and it wasn't just something that was out in the flock. It was part of their family for 2 weeks. So you can tell they probably became attached to that. There are all kinds of rules about what happens if you steal sheep from somebody else. If you steal a sheep and you slaughter it or you sell it, and so it's gone, you can't get it back, and they find out about it, you have to repay 4 for 1. The punishment is you got to get 4 sheep to give back to the guy that you stole the one from. If you get caught with the sheep, which is, maybe I can kind of understand this story. If you get caught with one and they're accusing you of stealing whatever, and they think you've stolen it, you have to repay double, just double, which is kind of a punishment to say don't do this. because, don't throw this in your flock. But it's not as harsh as the stolen and slaughtered and that sort of stuff. And so it's not great if the guy really was innocent, but it's not a horrible punishment if he was, But that's how they dealt with that. If you're in possession of that sheep, you pay double. Now, what I thought was interesting, they even have rules about what if you're borrowing or supposed to be keeping somebody else's sheep safe. So you're supposed to be watching. And you're sitting there and go, well, how could that happen with, these flocks? Well, it may be that actually, Mike and I have sheep or goats, and so I need to borrow his male. Well, if that male dies while I'm keeping it, how do they handle that? And the interesting thing is the two people would get together, and that they would, if they both swore an oath that I did not kill this animal, I did not eat it, I did not whatever, they would swear an oath and it was okay. Because those things happen. So they had rules even of doing that. Now, if they got caught lying in the oath, big punishment. But anyway. So they even have rules about sacrifices. When you took an animal to the temple, you'd present it to the temple, the priest would check it over and whatever. Well, the offering rules for the sheep and some of these other animals, that you sacrifice the firstborn of your flock, that first male. Now, I don't know if it was always the whole flock's first male or what. I don't know how that worked, but, I don't know the numbers. But that first male, you kept it for 7 days, and then on the 8th day, you took it to the temple. And which is the 8th day for circumcision for babies and everything. So they had that 1 week rule, and everything was kind of interesting. Now I'm going to give you some numbers that I've tried to put in perspective so our brain can maybe kind of get it. When Moses was involved and they invaded the Midianites, it said they took 675,000 sheep. Okay, I'm going to give you some numbers of what that means to try to put it in perspective. I kind of did an estimation of how big a sheep is, and they're not probably a square yard, but they're probably half a square yard. So I said, okay, for each square yard, if I'm just talking about number of acres to put all those sheep in, I'm going to say 2 per square yard. That's how I did the math. That number of sheep, 675,000 sheep, just standing together, all bunched together, would occupy 70 acres of land. I took it and said, okay, what if you're going to feed them? And so some of the stuff I ran across, and pasture can vary, and where you are and what they can eat and whatever. But this one article I was reading that said a decent grazing rate is probably 6 goats or sheep per acre. So if you're going to take 675,000 sheep and you're going to graze them in a pasture of 6 acres per animal, you're talking about 4,050,000 acres. So obviously that's a lot of sheep, a lot of land, a lot of movement, whatever. But anyway, the other thing that was interesting, when Joshua moved in on these other tribes and these other things, remember some of the wars of claiming the Holy Land, they killed the sheep as well. Now in other parts they didn't, but Joshua, they wiped out the sheep and everything. So where was David when Samuel came to look for the new king? Yeah, he's the rut. Oh, he's out with the sheep. They had all these brothers, but David was out watching the sheep. So when David comes to watch the battle before the Goliath episode, he shows up, and what do his brothers say? Brothers are mad at David. He said, "You're supposed to be watching the sheep. You left the sheep out in the wilderness." That's our food and our clothing and our shelter. And you've done that. So they were not happy with him either. One of the threats that David makes to Goliath, and you understand, David wasn't old enough to be in the army, but he'd already been doing this job of shepherding. He said, I've killed a lion and a bear, and I've taken the sheep out of their mouth. You're no big deal. And so it's kind of interesting that God had already taken David and protected him, and I guess David is pretty good with that sling or his rod and his staff or whatever, and so, When David encounters Nabal, who, Abigail became David's wife, his daughter, but Nabal was out shearing sheep. Nabal pissed off David, and Abigail was trying to protect her father and didn't want that, so she brought food to David and his men, and she brought, baskets of bread and whatever, but she also had 5 sheep slaughtered and fed him sheep. There's a story about Samuel telling David when David falls in love with Bathsheba, and the story goes that there was a man who only owned 1 sheep. So let's say that's Micah and I'm David, and so I'm King David. I got lots of flocks. Micah has this 1 lamb, and it says the lamb lived with his family, his children played with it. Loved lamb, the only lamb the family had. And it said that not David, well, it ended up being David in the story, but when Samuel's telling David the story, he hasn't told David who the actors are. But the other guy, the me guy that's actually is David, but David doesn't know that. He said the other guy had a guest coming, so did he sacrifice one of his 1,000 sheep? No, he went to the other guys, grabbed the poor guy's sheep, and then he killed it and fed it to his guests. So David hears this story about the sheep and gets all pissed off. And Samuel says, that's what you're doing with Uriah the Hittite. You've taken Bathsheba. You've taken his lamb, and you've got lots of wives. So it hit home for David, but it had to be told in a way that he would hear it and catch it. And David as king was just incensed that anybody would do that about somebody else's lamb. So Samuel's story hit home. In 2 Chronicles 5:6, if you want to read this, but just throw that out there. When Solomon built the temple and everything else, they were having the sacrifices, and it says, as far as sheep and goats or whatever, it says there were too many to be counted. Now I just told you how many they counted from the Midianites, so I wonder how many that was. I don't know. But there's too many to be counted, whatever that means. Sheep obviously are important in their economy because in the city of Jerusalem, when Nehemiah builds the wall, there's a sheep gate. So the guys were working on building the wall at the sheep gate. One of the things that Job loses when he is cursed in this ordeal with God and Satan is that all of his sheep are killed. Some guy comes and said, all your sheep are dead. Done. David has a lot of discussions in Psalms about sheep and about the different things and comparing them to humans and everything else. And so one of the things he said that, he said, you gave us up to be devoured like sheep and have scattered us among the nations. Yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. They are like sheep and are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd, but the upright will prevail over them in the morning. Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. He's talking about humans, but he's throwing the sheep in. Even while you sleep among the sheep pens, the wings of my dove are sheathed with silver, its feathers with shining gold. So let's talk. I think I'm ready for this, maybe not. Now let me just go and read. I'll read through all these, just because I've got this. Oh God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? But he brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the wilderness. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be shepherd of his people, Jacob of Israel, his inheritance. So we're going back to Jacob and where the sheep probably came from. So David's sheep had genetics or back from Laban. We could trace that. Then we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will praise you forever. From generation to generation, we will proclaim your praise. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. I have strayed like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I have not forgotten your commands. Our barns will be filled with every kind of provision. Our sheep will increase by thousands, by tens of thousands in our fields. Tell me, you whom I love, where you graze your flock and where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman beside the flocks of your friends? This is kind of interesting. If you do not know, most beautiful of women, Follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. This is in Song of Solomon. Song of Songs. So in other words, they're saying, hey girl, if you want to find a man, this is what you do. Follow the footprints, follow the sheep, go find the tents, graze your goats there, just act like you're innocent, bring the goats around, okay. They also are talking about how pretty her teeth are, and she's compared to sheep. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming up from washing. Each has its twin, not one of them is alone. Now, sheep kind of, with the wool on the outer part, it's going to be kind of grayish and have dirt and maybe some other stuff. But when you shear it underneath, it's snow white. And what's the washing? Well, oftentimes they wash them maybe to try to, take away any pests or anything that might be in there. So they've done some cleaning as well. But that's what he's saying her teeth look like. They're that white. And it said that in 2 different verses. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep coming up from the washing. Each has a twin, not one of them is missing. Isn't that funny? Then sheep will graze as in their own pasture. Lambs will feed among the ruins of the rich. So I've kind of gone into the sheep. Now let's go into goats a little bit, and then we'll get back into some of the stuff. But goats. There's a passage in there when they were in the wilderness that one of the ways they handled sin, obviously, they did sacrifice. They'd take an unblemished and the sacrifice on the altar. But the other thing once a year they would do is they had this whole ceremony. They'd take this goat, and also a goat that had to meet the criteria of how it looked and whatever, no unblemished or whatever. And they'd take this goat, and they would ceremoniously put all the sins of the people on this goat. Now, did they sacrifice the goat? No. They sent it out in the wilderness to die. So they wanted, it's an image that we're taking our sins and we're getting them away from us. The image with the sheep is you got to have a blood price paid. The image with the goat is you got to get it out of your home. You got to get it out of your life. You got to get rid of it. Because they had sheep and goats around them all the time, and so, but that was the whole deal. So that was a process they did. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about differences between sheep and goats. I've got them. I've been around them pretty much all my life in different ways and fashions. Sheep tend to graze in the open, kind of more in the center. If this was a pasture, the sheep would be grazing in here. However, the goats, on the other hand, goats do the edges. Goats walk around and they'll look for any hole they can find. If you find any goat owner, they'll tell you, how do you keep goats in the pen? Well, you take the pen, you fill it up with water. If it'll hold water, it'll hold goats. Meaning that you can't have any holes, because if they find a hole, they're out. And trust me, they will, underneath gates, through holes, if it's available. If you leave the gate open for 10 minutes and you turn around, the goats are already through it. That's the kind of critters they are. Whereas the sheep will stay together more, and goats are kind of have their own little, mind, and they, you'll find your goats, but you'll find them spread out. They're not going to be all together like sheep. Sheep are easy, there they are, but the goats, where are the goats, and where's this one, and whatever. And so they kind of graze together, and the way that they herd is different. Goats have a definite pecking order, who is the outstanding one and who is not. And they, if you're putting out feed, they'll fight over it. The sheep, somewhat, but not as much. In other words, I can pour out feed and the sheep will all eat right beside each other. If there's goats, one goat is going to try to create a big zone around itself and nobody gets any of this. So they're kind of greedier in a way eating. The other thing that's kind of weird about sheep and goats is just what they eat, because sheep tend to graze and whatever, do nothing to the brush and the trees. Goats are browsers. And so if a goat can get its feet on a tree or can pull it down or anything else, they're going to eat the leaves of this tree. And so anything that the goat can reach, they're going to eat. And the other thing about them is the way I like to say it is, sheep can be pretty content with what they've got. Goats are always looking for something better. It's like they'll eat a little of this and a little of that, but if you're offering them something, they're going to check out what it is. I was trimming some branches yesterday, and I knew that they'll eat some of the leaves and stuff. So I just took them and chunked them out there, and I've got this matriarch. She's the pecking order top. She saw that from a distance. She's like, I better get over there and see what that is. Well, the whole group follows her, but she's like, I'm looking for something better. So in a way, when you even talk about the goat being cast out from the group, it's like humans. We're like that. We're always looking for something better. I need a better house. I need a better car. I need a better tie. I need some better shoes. Right? So there's a little bit of humanity in the goats as well, comparing them to being sinful as opposed to the sheep. But at the same time. Now, as the other thing I'd say about them is I don't think that, I don't know how smarts and not smarts. Goats are pretty dang smart. Sheep, not as much. The funny thing about sheep, though, is they're very much a herd group. They stick together and whatever. But if I was taking my sheep and running them through here, and I get them through here, and Micah decides that he's going to scare them and do like this so that one of them jumps. Once Micah's done that, the rest of the line will jump when it gets there. They've seen them jump, and they're going to jump. The weird thing is they will not always jump at the same spot. So by the time is over, they may be jumping out here, they may be jumping up there, but every one of them is going to jump until somebody doesn't see it, and then they stop. But if one of them jumps, they're all going to jump. Back to human beings. Do we see what other people do and we do it? But sheep will do that. Goats won't do that. Goats, somebody can jump and the other guys are going to judge when they get there, am I going to jump or not? They're going to look at it like, is there something I should do? But if not, they're just going to run through. But sheep will jump, and they'll all jump, and it's kind of fun. You can trigger it and then watch it all happen. And until it lasts long enough that they've kind of wiped it out, or they've moved it away, or gotten in the open where there's nothing there, But typically, they'll all just jump. Chromosomes. Human beings have 46 chromosomes. Sheep have 54, and goats have 60. So I think it's funny. Their gestational age, their number of chromosomes, it's all kind of similar. Twins, because they talk about, in Song of Solomon, like a sheep with twins. If you're raising animals, twins are great because that way you get twice as many. Well, it also comes with a price, because the mother has to feed twins. And there are triplets, and, you can get other numbers. The most I've had with goats have been triplets. And oh my gosh, that just blows your mind. You're like looking and going, one head, two head. No, there's three heads, and that I've got video of that. I'm kind of, and I love it because you say, well, count that number of babies we have. And you're like, 1, 2, there's 3. Well, twins and goats, it's on the order of about 34% will be singles, 65% will be twins, and 1% will be the other numbers. As far as sheep tend to have the first lambing will be singles, but then after that, a lot of times they'll have twins, but not all of them. And there's another thing that I want to tell you that is interesting about them is that both sheep and goats, they don't want to feed somebody else's baby. So how do they do that? Well, when they're nursing, they sniff down and they sniff their butts because that's what's there. So they'll sniff the butt, and if it's not their animal, their baby, they run them off. Start, taking their heads and butting them away. So through the ages, sheep owners, and they probably did this stuff even back in David's time, they'd figured out that this thing that the sense of smell is pretty important. So you can make a mama sheep take another lamb. Let's say that this mama has a lamb and the lamb dies. If you take the hide off the one that died and take this hide and make like cut some leg holes and everything else and put it on another lamb, she'll accept that one because it smells right and she'll feed it. And so you could take one that had twins and then this one had one and it died. You could take the twins, separate the twins and give it to this other mother, which is a good thing. They're getting more groceries and everything else. But that's one of the ways that they can do that is put the hide on there. I don't know that you could really do that with goats, but it might be possible. But and I'm not really a person who's really big into doing that kind of stuff. But Because to them, you didn't want to send, they didn't do bottle feeding of babies and stuff like that. You don't want to spend all your day trying to feed bottle feed all these. So you'd much rather have a mama take care of that baby. That's one way they could do that. Now I'm going to do the 23rd Psalm. And I'm going to break it down. And then we're going to go into Jesus a little bit more. But it says, the Lord is my shepherd. And I told you there's all those images of David. So David's still using the same theme. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Why is green important? Well, because there's stuff to eat. And a green pasture said there's probably a lot of good grass for grazing. That's the other thing that's weird, because goats don't necessarily like grass. They might eat it, but they don't. But sheep really like grass. The other thing that's good about sheep and goats both is that when they graze, they don't kill what they're eating. Horses actually can pull it up and you end up with nothing growing. But the sheep thin it down just like a lawnmower and it'll grow back. So when you see these pictures in England of these castles, a lot of times you'd see the sheep flocks out there in the area and they're just mowing the grass. And they'd move them around to mow the grass. So he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Well, you probably don't want your water too still because then it's stagnant and not good, but would you rather drink from trying to get through the rocks and try to drink at a rapid, or would you try to drink where the water's, calmer and better? Yeah, you'd rather do that. He restores my soul. Wow. I don't know anything about that with the sheep, but, he started the imagery, but it's in there. So, basically, I guess for the sheep, I'm content. Maybe that's another way of saying it. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Let's go into the right paths. The shepherd, David, when he was guarding those sheep, it's his job to move those animals between things like water and food and keep them away from the wilderness and from the things that are going to hurt them and keep the sheep out of the rocky stuff. Now, the goats love the rocks, but the sheep don't. But try to keep them where that they're not in places that a predator could easily get them. And so it's a protective thing of he leading them the right way, into the right stuff. They got to get food and water every day. And and the other thing about them that I think is interesting too is weather. Because sheep, they really like, you get them out of the wind, sheep are pretty happy. Goats really like to be dry and out of the wind. So it's better if you can have some kind of top for goats, but sheep are good if you can just put up a wall that they can keep out of the wind. And another thing that is kind of bad about sheep, if you have enough of them, if they really stick together, but they can create problems for themselves if they can actually, in certain kind of conditions, get pushed in so much that the center ones can suffocate, like we do at crowds, these concerts. That sheep can do that. Goats really won't run into that. Goats are like, no, I'm not doing that, and I'm not going to get that close to you. So it's kind of funny. But they got to take them through the right places. Even though I walk through the darkest valley of death, like a lamb to the slaughter, I'm not afraid. My shepherd's got me, is what he's saying. My shepherd protects me. For you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Gosh, that's a strange concept. How could sticks that are more likely for hitting comfort me? If somebody's comfort me, they give me a blanket. They give me a nice place to sit. They give me shade. Not a rod and a staff. Well, what they're saying is the rod and the staff were used against the predators. If I'm going to beat a coyote, good thing to beat him with. A bear. I'd much rather have this beating a bear than this, but I'd probably use either one, right? But they comfort them, and what they're saying with that is they protect them, but the other thing is they use these to guide them. So if they got to separate them out, they got to use stuff to move them. One thing I don't have, and I don't know when, I haven't done the historical thing of when in history these came out, but there's something called a shepherd's crook that would be a stick that's probably longer than this, and it'd have a hook on it, so that way you can hook the sheep and redirect them. That'd be another thing that they might have, but this is a rod and a staff. So it's something they're using for protection. The other thing that you kind of get an imagery of, I think, is who uses this kind of stuff normally? Micah, do you need this or do I need this? I'm getting a little old, Micah. Do I need something to help me get around? I mean, Mike, I just kind of wonder, what's going to happen when my bad hip's bothering me? How am I going to get around, Micah? You don't need this. But do you kind of see God as being older and wiser? God walking with a rod and a staff? God knows where the water is. God knows where the good pasture is. God knows what's good for you as a sheep. So there's some of that imagery in there. Now it goes back to the people. You prepare a table before me, which the green pasture is the table, but you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. We're going to go graze, and there's sheep, and there's coyotes, and there's bobcats, and there's lions, and there's bears, and it's all cool. God's not letting them get me. I'm going to have a feast. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Just more images of comfort, and oh, this is a great place to be. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Not just the 14 days they're talking about with the lamb, but you get to live in that house the whole time. Kind of weird, yeah? Cool. Okay. Let's see if I put. Here we go. So, Isaiah 57. Now we're getting to Jesus. Isaiah 53:7 says, He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. Interesting thing also about sheep, and I read this, and it was an observational thing that I should have gotten, but I didn't. But when I read it, I thought they're absolutely right. If you take a sheep and you turn it over on its back, where it's defenseless, it gets quiet and it doesn't fight. Goats don't do that. You turn a goat over and it'll keep trying to get away. But a sheep will do that. And I have a picture of my daughter holding this baby lamb, and she's holding it like a baby. And I'm like, why isn't that thing kicking at her? Why isn't it kicking her face? Why isn't it trying to get away? So they knew this, and it's like I said, it truly is a real thing. I've seen it. But like a shearer, you turn the thing over on its back and you shear it, it doesn't really do anything. Kind of interesting. Now you got to get it to its back because it's a big animal and you got to flip it. But once you do that, it's all good. So that's that sheep imagery for Jesus. Is he went to the cross, didn't fight, didn't cry out. He's the good shepherd. And we talk about the sacrificial blood like that they put on the doors. And so there's a lot of imagery with sheep and goats. But Jesus is the good shepherd. God's the good shepherd. They know what we need. And so I hope that you can take these images and these things and kind of help let it enlighten your scriptures and kind of take you through the week and have a different thought about the way things are. Because we're kind of living in a world that, how many of us raise our own food or anything else? Well, sheep and goats are out there. Michael, would you close us in prayer?
All right, I guess if we can bow our heads. Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to travel here safely to a New Day Fellowship. Thank you for allowing us to even live to see another day and for protecting us as we headed here, even as we went to sleep at night. God, please let us to continue to showcase who you are and keep your word in our mind, hearts, and soul as we move forward through this upcoming week, and let it be a blessing to everyone. Heavenly Father, in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.